If you are heading into retirement with $1.5 million, you are not in trouble. But you are also not in a position to coast on lazy assumptions, outdated rules of thumb, or vague optimism, because retirement at this level can be comfortable, flexible, and deeply secure only if the money is handled with discipline, timing, and a clear understanding of what that number can actually support in the real world. A few years ago, 1.5 million sounded almost untouchable to many people. Today, after years of inflation, rising living costs, and relentless pressure on everything from groceries to housing to travel, it still represents a strong retirement foundation. But it does not automatically guarantee the lifestyle people imagine when they hear the number. That is the truth many retirees need to hear. 1.5 million is not a magic shield. It is a powerful resource, but like every resource, its value depends on how intelligently it is used. The real question is not whether 1.5 million is enough in some abstract universal sense. The real question is what kind of retirement it can realistically create in Canada, how much monthly income it can support, how vulnerable it is to taxes, inflation, poor timing, and market shocks, and what decisions make the difference between simply surviving retirement and actually enjoying it. To make that clearer, imagine a couple entering retirement at age 65 with exactly this amount saved. They are both healthy, both ready to leave full-time work behind, and both looking at the same question that sits in the minds of so many Canadians. What does this amount really allow us to do? Not in theory, in practice. That is where retirement planning becomes useful, because what matters is not just the size of the pile. It is how the pile interacts with time, taxes, pensions, inflation, investment returns, lifestyle choices, and the unexpected events that life has a habit of throwing into every plan. Start with the foundation. A couple aged 64, retiring when they turn 65, planning to age 90, gives us a 25-year retirement window. That is a common planning horizon because it is conservative enough to reduce the risk of running short while still being realistic for healthy retirees. Could one or both live beyond 90? Absolutely. Could one die earlier? Also, yes. That uncertainty is exactly why retirement planning needs margin. If you build a plan that only works under perfect conditions, then you do not really have a plan. You have a hope. Let us assume this couple owns their home outright, worth around $750,000, but they do not want to rely on it for everyday retirement spending. That is a very common mindset. Many retirees see the home as a backup asset, a legacy asset, or simply a place they do not want to disturb unless absolutely necessary. So, for a clean analysis, set the house aside at first and ask whether the 1.5 million investment portfolio alone can fund the retirement lifestyle they want. Inside that portfolio, imagine a mix that many Canadian retirees would recognize: large RRSP balances, healthy TFSAs, and some non-registered money on the side. Nothing exotic, no corporate structure, no private holdings, just a fairly standard accumulation pattern built over decades. On top of that, add government benefits. Since both are lifelong Canadian residents, assume full OAS. For CPP, assume they are not maximum contributors but solid earners, so each receives roughly 75% of the maximum. That puts them in a strong but realistic position, closer to what many upper-middle retirement households actually look like. Now comes the part most people care about most: spending. And this is where retirement planning gets far more interesting than simply dividing a big number by a number of years. Most retirees do not spend the same amount throughout retirement. Early years tend to be more active, more ambitious, and more expensive. These are the years for travel, hobbies, home improvements, family support, dining out, and all the plans people postponed while working. Later years often slow down. Spending may decline as travel decreases and routines settle. Then, in very late retirement, spending may stay moderate or rise again depending on health care and support needs. So rather than assume a flat line forever, it makes sense to build retirement in phases. Suppose this couple wants $10,000 per month after tax from age 65 to 75, $9,000 from 75 to 85, and $7,500 from 85 to 90. That is not a bare-bones retirement. It is a good lifestyle, one that allows for freedom and enjoyment, but it is also not wildly extravagant given today's cost environment. The question becomes whether 1.5 million plus CPP and OAS can really carry that. At first glance, the answer is close, but not quite as simple as many would hope. A high-level projection with reasonable assumptions such as 3% long-term inflation and roughly 5.5% long-term portfolio returns on a balanced portfolio suggests the couple is near the line, but not safely over it. They are not failing. They are not doomed. But they are also not overflowing with excess. Under straightforward assumptions, they may end up slightly short, with the portfolio exhausting itself in the late 80s, rather than carrying them comfortably all the way through the full planning horizon. That result surprises some people because 1.5 million feels enormous at the starting line. But retirement is expensive when it stretches over decades, especially when income goals are after-tax amounts and inflation quietly lifts every future dollar requirement higher and higher. This is where the deeper planning begins, because once you are close, strategy matters enormously. One of the first strategic decisions is which accounts to draw from and when. Many people, including many advisors, default to spending TFSAs early because doing so keeps taxable income lower in the first years of retirement. That can make sense emotionally because it feels efficient and keeps taxes tame at the beginning, but it often creates a different problem later. If you empty tax-free accounts too soon and leave large RRSP balances untouched, those RRSPs continue growing into bigger future taxable withdrawals. That can increase lifetime tax, create more pressure later, and reduce flexibility precisely when flexibility becomes more valuable. In many cases, it makes more sense to begin drawing taxable registered money earlier, smoothing taxes over time and preserving TFSA assets as long-term tax-free flexibility for later retirement. This does not always produce dramatic visual differences in the short term, but over the full length of a retirement, the tax effect can be substantial. A plan that looks only at gross returns and account balances without carefully sequencing withdrawals is leaving money on the table. Another major lever is the timing of CPP and OAS. Taking both at 65 is common because it feels natural. People reach 65, stop working, and want government income to begin immediately. But delaying CPP can significantly increase the future payment. Each year of delay adds value, and by age 70, the increase is meaningful. OAS can also be deferred, though the trade-offs there are not always as compelling depending on the situation. For a couple with solid assets, good health, and enough portfolio flexibility to bridge the gap, delaying CPP can strengthen the long-term income floor and reduce pressure on the portfolio later. That matters because guaranteed, inflation-adjusted income becomes more valuable the older you get. Markets do not guarantee stability. Government pensions, despite all the public debate around them, remain one of the few truly dependable pillars in a retirement plan. When CPP and OAS become a larger share of household income later in life, the whole plan becomes more resilient. This does not mean delay is always the right move. If health is poor, if cash flow is tight, or if the retiree simply values earlier access more than a bigger later benefit, taking benefits sooner may still be right. But the point is that timing is strategic, not automatic. Tax optimization is another area where large improvements can happen without any increase in savings at all. Two households can begin retirement with identical account balances and end up with very different outcomes simply because one household withdraws money in a smarter order, manages brackets more deliberately, and minimizes the unnecessary buildup of future tax pressure. If you model the withdrawals carefully across RRSPs, TFSAs, non-registered funds, CPP, and OAS, it is often possible to reduce lifetime tax dramatically. That may not always show up as a giant leap in monthly spending capacity, but it often boosts estate value, preserves flexibility, and creates room that would otherwise be lost to the government. This is one of the most overlooked truths in retirement. You do not always improve a plan by earning more. Very often you improve it by leaking less. Then there is asset allocation. If certain accounts, such as TFSAs, are intended to stay untouched for longer, it may make sense for those assets to hold slightly more growth potential, provided the retirees can tolerate the added volatility. That does not mean taking reckless risks. It means aligning each account with its role in the plan. A TFSA that is not needed for immediate income may be the perfect place to hold more growth-oriented investments because the growth is sheltered from tax and the money has more time to compound. Small adjustments like this do not always transform a plan overnight, but they can move a borderline retirement into a workable one. And that is often all that is needed. Once those kinds of improvements are layered together, the original near-miss plan may become fully viable. Not extravagantly overfunded, but viable. That distinction matters. A plan sitting exactly at the line may technically work, but it offers no protection if life deviates from the assumptions. And life always deviates from assumptions. That is why stress testing matters. It is easy to feel confident in a retirement plan when everything behaves nicely. It is far more useful to ask what happens if the worst timing shows up at the worst moment. Picture a severe market crash in the first year of retirement. That is one of the most damaging moments for a portfolio to take a hit, because withdrawals begin immediately while asset values are falling. Then layer on weaker long-term returns and slightly higher inflation. Then add longer life expectancy, because living longer is a blessing personally but a larger burden financially if the plan was already tight. Under that kind of stress, a retirement that originally looked manageable can crack badly. The portfolio may deplete years early, leaving the household relying mostly on government benefits long before they expected. That does not mean the original plan was foolish. It means the original plan lacked enough buffer to absorb multiple shocks at once, and that is precisely what stress tests are designed to reveal. When retirees see a scenario like that, the goal is not panic. The goal is adjustment. Once you understand where the cracks form, you can decide which trade-offs are acceptable. Perhaps one spouse can take on a flexible part-time consulting role for a few years. Even a moderate income for a short stretch early in retirement can have an outsized positive effect because it reduces withdrawals, preserves portfolio growth, and strengthens the whole plan. Perhaps retirement can be delayed by 1 year, though emotionally many people hate that option even when it works mathematically. Perhaps spending goals can be reduced slightly, not in a painful way, but in a way that trims excess from the original ideal. A 5% drop in spending often feels much smaller in daily life than retirees expect, yet it can make a significant difference in plan durability. This is one of the great lessons of retirement modeling. Small adjustments made early are often far more powerful than dramatic sacrifices made later under pressure. Now bring the home back into the picture. Even though many retirees do not want to count home equity as retirement spending capital, downsizing is extremely common in the second half of retirement, not because people failed, but because their lives changed. The large family house becomes more work, more maintenance, more cost, and less useful. A move to something smaller, simpler, or more accessible can free up capital while also reducing stress. If this couple sells a $750,000 home later and buys something around $550,000, that extra capital entering the plan can materially improve their retirement outlook. It can restore buffer, support higher spending, or simply create a larger safety margin. In practice, this means that many retirees with $1.5 million plus a mortgage-free home have more flexibility than a strict portfolio-only analysis suggests. The key is not to depend on it blindly, but to recognize it as a real option. Once the plan is strengthened by good withdrawal sequencing, smarter benefit timing, possible part-time income, modest spending adjustments, and perhaps future downsizing, $1.5 million can absolutely support a strong retirement in Canada for many couples. But here is the part people most need to hear. It supports a strong retirement because of decisions, not because of the number alone. The number is only the starting material. The plan is what turns it into actual income and security. Without strategy, $1.5 million can be wasted surprisingly inefficiently. With strategy, it can do far more than people expect. That is why generic headlines about retirement numbers are so unhelpful. They strip away the very factors that determine whether a plan works: tax structure, pension timing, spending pattern, market resilience, and personal flexibility. This also explains why the same $1.5 million can produce very different outcomes for different people. A couple retiring at 60 with no pensions yet available and a desire to spend heavily will face more pressure than a couple retiring at 68 with lower spending needs. A single retiree with modest expenses may find 1.5 million overwhelmingly sufficient. A couple carrying debt, supporting adult children, or insisting on very high spending may find it less generous than expected. The number matters, but the lifestyle attached to it matters more. If you are looking at 1.5 million and asking whether you can retire, the honest answer is that you probably can, but you should not do it blindly. You should not assume a rough average return and hope for the best. You should not assume that $10,000 a month today means the same thing 10 years from now. You should not assume your account mix is tax efficient just because you have multiple accounts. And you should definitely not assume that the default sequence of taking money from one account before another is harmless. Retirement is too expensive and too important for assumptions to do the work of planning. What a properly built plan gives you is more than a yes or no answer. It shows you the trade-offs. It shows you what happens if you delay CPP. What happens if you reduce spending slightly? What happens if one spouse works a little? What happens if you downsize? What happens if markets misbehave? What happens if you live longer than expected? When you can see those scenarios clearly, retirement stops feeling like a cliff and starts feeling like a managed transition. That shift matters psychologically as much as financially. People do not just want to know if they can retire. They want to know they can keep living well after they do. They want to know that inflation will not quietly eat their future, that taxes will not take more than necessary, that market volatility will not force them into panic, and that they are not one bad decade away from regret. Good planning answers those fears with structure. It does not promise perfection, but it does provide clarity. And clarity is one of the most valuable assets any retiree can have. So what does retiring in Canada with 1.5 million really look like? It looks strong, but not careless. Comfortable, but not automatic. Flexible, but only when the choices supporting it are made deliberately. For a healthy couple at 65 with a paid-off home, moderate government pensions, and a willingness to think in phases rather than fixed numbers, it can support a very good retirement. But the strongest version of that retirement usually involves thoughtful sequencing, realistic return assumptions, built-in buffer, and a willingness to make adjustments instead of pretending none will ever be needed. That is the real story behind the number. Not fear, not hype, not fantasy, just strategy. And once strategy enters the picture, 1.5 million becomes not just an impressive balance, but a retirement that can actually work. There is another reason retirees with this level of savings need to be careful, and it has nothing to do with whether 1.5 million sounds large or small. It has to do with confidence drift. People who save well often assume the hardest part is over once they hit the number. In reality, the planning challenge changes shape. During working years, the mission is accumulation. In retirement, the mission becomes distribution, tax control, and risk management. Those are completely different skills. A household can be excellent at building wealth and still make weak decisions when it comes time to turn that wealth into sustainable income. That is why retirement planning should never stop at the sentence, "We have enough." The better sentence is, "How do we draw this efficiently, protect it from avoidable damage, and make sure it keeps serving us as conditions change?" Sequence risk, tax drag, overspending early, and poor benefit timing can quietly erode even strong starting balances. So can lifestyle creep. Many retirees assume the first few years are the reward years, and they should spend freely while they still have health and energy, and emotionally that makes sense. But freedom without guardrails becomes expensive fast. The solution is not joyless restraint. The solution is intentional design. If you want to travel heavily from 65 to 75, build that into the plan. If you expect to help children or grandchildren, build that in too. If one spouse is much more conservative than the other, address that before retirement begins, rather than after the first market drop causes conflict. A strong retirement plan is not just mathematically sound, it is behaviorally realistic. It respects how people actually live, spend, worry, and change. It also gets reviewed. That matters more than many people think. A retirement plan built at 64 should not be thrown in a drawer and trusted blindly for the next 25 years. It should be revisited when inflation shifts, markets move sharply, one spouse dies, health changes, tax rules evolve, a home is sold, or spending clearly departs from the original pattern. That does not mean the plan failed. It means the plan is alive. The most successful retirees are rarely those with the most perfect assumptions on day one. They are the ones who stay engaged, flexible, and willing to fine-tune as life unfolds. Precision in retirement is not paranoia. It is how security lasts. Smart Pension Canada.